Good morning, everybody. This is Tommy Johnson from the Portland Regional Chamber of Commerce. Thank you so much for joining us today on our webinar that we're very, very pleased to deliver to you. Today's topic is decision making in turbulent times with Erin Lessard of Lessard Consulting. We've got quite a number of people who registered for this event, so it should be pretty packed. Hopefully, we've got lots of questions that come out of the event. I know some of you may have attended the event last week. Erin did the first of a couple of webinars she's doing with us. Last week's topic was how to lead a virtual team. And again, with today's topic, it's sort of a continuation of that, decision making in turbulent times, and how you can use some of your skills to affect change. Just a little bit about Erin, and I'll let her take it away after that. Erin is a coach and expert who's been a consultant for highly successful leaders in Fortune 500 firms all around the world. She blends her corporate experience, her coaching prowess, and her belief in authentic leadership to be able to transform clients' lives. She's got a new book, which hopefully she'll talk about too, called Decision Flow. And there's an 8-week companion course that she's able to offer as well. But with that, I'm very pleased to present and take it over, Erin Clymer Lessard.
Thanks so much, Tommy. Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you again, and I'm looking forward to sharing some of the insights that I've learned with my clients, from my clients, some of the things I teach my clients about decision making. I'm going to be pulling a lot from the book that is just recently published, Decision Flow, the Authentic Leader's Guide to Making the Right Decision When the Stakes Are High. And when I was writing this book last year, I was pulling from I tell lots of stories in the book about leaders who've had to make tough decisions and had to learn how to find a different way of making decisions. I had no clue the sort of global high stakes we would be in when this book launched. So I'm gonna call it timely, and I'm excited to get to share some of these learnings and lessons from you. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen so you can see some slides. Go. So what I want to share with you is I'm going to start off with a bit of a baseline on what goes into decision making. A lot of us think about processes, decision-making processes that we rely on that give us different steps, and they take out some of the guesswork. And processes are wonderful. So I'm going to start with some process thinking. Mind Tools is a website you can go to with lots of different information, short articles, leadership and management lessons. And I looked them up to see what they had to say about decision making. And there are over 40 different tools and processes that they link to. So there's a plethora of ways that you can go about decision making. I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of my baseline on decision making process. And then I want to get into the difference between problem solving and decision making, which is a pretty critical difference to understand. I'm going to share the 7 mindset tricks that I teach my clients to get into decision flow. And decision flow is the place where you can make decisions without all of the obstacles that get in our way. I'll talk about some of those obstacles. And then I'm going to give you a couple of exercises to get started to find your flow as well. Decision-making baseline. So some of the things that I encourage all of my clients and the leaders I work with to consider when they're looking at big decisions. The first thing is to choose good alternatives and consider the risk. So an important component is being able to understand, here are the things I'm choosing between, and really see them as independent. Sometimes we get sort of caught up in a spin of all the different choices we're making or all the different factors. And so really being able to see them as alternatives and then recognize what is the risk associated with each of these. What is my risk appetite? To get in the car is to assume some risk. So we all have different levels of risk willingness, the willingness we have to take on risk. Nothing is risk-free, so it's understanding what we're willing to take and recognizing that status quo, staying put, so right now choosing to wait it out and see what happens, that's an alternative. And it has risk associated with it. We often kind of think waiting and seeing is the safe bet, but it's not without risk. So we need to understand it as something we're choosing. If we choose to do nothing, we're making a decision to wait things out. So that's point one in the baseline. Point two is recognizing that we come with biases, we make assumptions, and it can lead to sloppy decision making or not thoroughly thought through decision making. So our brains love to find the quick answer and the easy solution to move forward. We are built in a way to help us cut through some of the clutter because there are just too many data points. We can't process everything. So we look for patterns. If I tell you a story about my friend who's a chef who's working up a new chili recipe and looking for fascinating ingredients to put in his chili, if I tell you that story and then put up a word problem and give you the letters S-O blank P, all of you now hear the word soup in your head because we were talking about chili. I'm gonna guess that none of you said soap, which would also be a solution to the word problem. We anchor our answers, our decisions, the way we think to the information around us. And it can get in our way. So recognizing that we have biases, recognizing that we jump to conclusions and make assumptions, and having a process for working ourselves back those assumptions. Sometimes it's with other people, sometimes it's just recognizing and stepping back. What data am I paying attention to, and what am I ignoring? So having your alternatives and knowing risk, challenging your biases and assumptions, and then getting other people's input and buy-in earlier than we might tend to. So sometimes we think we have to make the decision, we have to have the tough call, and we do our work and we go through our process, and we haven't gotten buy-in or input early enough in our decision making, and then we fail to get the buy-in when it's time to implement. So getting that input early is important. And then finally, if you sell anything, if you're considering what you might need to put in the market that's different now, how you might need it to pivot, everybody's favorite word, I think the best thing to come out of the agile world is the notion of an MVP, a minimum viable product. So you don't need to have everything figured out. You need to know what your minimum viable product is, test it, learn, adjust, repeat. So being able to know your alternatives, challenge your assumptions, get people's input, and then put something out there and test and learn, be willing to try, and know you don't have to have everything figured out right now. You can test along the way. So that's a baseline of decision making that I want us to sort of anchor into. And now I want to talk about what gets in the way of doing this, because what I find with my clients is even when they go through a whole process and there is a point where they have to now make the decision or act the decision, that's when things get tricky. So when the stakes are high, process isn't always enough. If it's a simple decision, it gets a little easier. But when we're dealing with things that have external consequences or consequences for other people, I see two traps that people tend to fall in. One is, I went through my process, I know what the right thing is to do, I've made a great decision, but now I can't get other people on board. It's execution time and people are stalling and dragging their feet and not moving forward. So in that situation, my leaders didn't get enough buy-in, didn't get enough input early on, and now their decision's dead in the water. It's going nowhere. The other trap I see is people going through the process, but then getting to that, okay, now do the thing, now it's time to act, and they can't pull the trigger. And again, their decision goes nowhere. So one critical thing to understand in this mix is the difference between problem solving and decision making. Decision making is forward thinking. It's about setting a future course. Problem solving is by nature rooted to a problem. It's looking at something that happened. It's backwards facing and course correcting that thing that happened. The risk that we run as leaders is when we confuse those two, we can apply simpler solutions from a problem-solving lens than we might come up with in a decision-making, forward-thinking lens. Decision-making can be more strategic. problem solving is focusing on, it's anchored, again, what our brain does, and anchoring back to what we see as the problem. So as we're looking at this world we're in now, there are lots of problems to solve for, and problem solving isn't a bad skill to have. It's what we promote a lot of people on. We love problem solvers, people who can take something and figure it out and fix it. And where we are now is a time when we have to look toward the future without crystal balls. We don't know what's coming. We don't know what's next. So we have to hold these together. Our risk is that we focus on the problem solving and find solutions that fix that thing that we understood, rather than thinking about what's next and how we prepare for the future and really think strategically going forward. An example I like to give of this is if you think about like not missing, say, your sales team, and you didn't miss your goals for the quarter. So a problem solving mindset is, what happened? Okay, we investigate, we understand that our conversion rates have gone down and aren't what we're used to. And so the problem solving solution that's anchored into how I understood the problem might be, we need to increase our sales volume because, or our call volume, because our conversion rate's lower. And that's not necessarily a bad choice, but it's different than the forward-thinking, decision-making, strategic space might say, all right, so our lead generation isn't working the way it used to. We need to find a different way of getting qualified leads. We need to maybe look at inbound marketing in a way we haven't tried before. So it's more creative and forward thinking, because it's not anchored to the problem as we knew it. We recognize a problem, we understand what happened, and now we look for creative ways forward. So as you're looking to make decisions here, as you're faced with things that you've probably never been faced before, check. Am I giving myself the forward-looking space, knowing that I may still have to solve some problems in the immediate term? Am I giving myself the decision-making permission to really pay attention to what's coming forward? So why do we struggle to decide? We struggle because we can't predict the future, and we want to protect ourselves from risk. This is wired into us to protect ourselves. And there are lots of factors going on here for us. And here's where we start to get beyond process. Process sometimes helps us work through these things or sidestep these issues, but often they show up anyway. And so we have to pay attention to what else is going on that's stopping us from making the decisions or implementing the decisions the way we know we could or need to. So one thing that gets in our way is our failure stories. We all have them. We all have little things that we replay from the past, places where we wish it had gone different and it didn't. And often those become ingrained in us as things to never do again. We want to learn from our lessons. I have a friend who talks about how we, as children were told to sit over there and think about what we did. And 40 years later, we're still sort of sitting there and thinking about what we did, and it gets in our way. This is in our evolutionary biology and psychology too. So we've got a couple of things going on. Our lower brain functions and even into our gut is constantly scanning the environment looking for threat. And we hear talk a lot about, we were evolved to pay attention to not get eaten by saber-toothed tigers, but it's not just physical threat that we were evolved for. We were evolved to stay socially safe, to stay in the group and not be kicked out, because that was death to get kicked out of the group. So we're paying attention not just for physical danger, we're paying attention for social danger as well and the threats around us. So that's going on without us thinking about it. Just like breathing is going on without you thinking about it. And then when we add in our logical brain with that, we're choosing what we pay attention to. So again, this goes back to the assumptions. We can't pay attention to every data point because there are too many of them. And so we choose them. And the data we choose is connected to our past experience. What has happened to us before, what beliefs we formed because of that, or assumptions we made. Now that influences what I see the next time around. So I've got this social scanning going on. I've got myself choosing data based on past experience. And if you've done any work with emotional intelligence and read any of Dan Goleman's work, he popularized the notion of the amygdala hijack. The amygdala is this tiny little part in our brain that regulates our emotional responses. It takes that data from below and from above and regulates how we respond. So we've got this underlying emotional state that's influencing how we make decisions, why we can't make decisions, why we make hasty decisions, why we sort of push something through when other people aren't on board. We tend to not recognize the influence these critical things have on our ability to make successful decisions. And it's vital that we recognize what's going on and help our brains learn different ways of functioning so that we can overcome these challenges and make better decisions. Here's what I teach in my book and in the accompanying program that I run. And I've learned this with my clients. So I've been a leadership development person for the last 15 years, working as a coach for the last 10. I've gotten to work with some incredible folks. And regardless of level, regardless of size of organization, these are familiar themes that come up, and where we have to work to get them into a place where they can trust their decision making, where they can know that they've done what they need to be informed and have people on board and trust that they're ready to go. So the first piece is the ability to listen to others. And we talk a lot about listening, but most of us listen to respond. We don't listen to understand. So listening means, did I give you the time to speak for most of us? But that's not what it means to the person speaking. Listening means, did I hear you? Do I understand what you're really saying, what your concerns are? So being able to listen really to what other people's needs are and check your own assumptions, that's what enables you to influence them before the decisions, before it's time to enact what you've decided. Getting them on board early is critical. Managing your instinctively defensive reactions. We do it without even knowing most of the time, right? So one thing you can start to do is pay attention to your tells. So if your palms get sweaty, if your face gets hot, if your breathing gets shallow or your heart rate increases, often we can experience those things, recognize that those are happening even before we know that we're being defensive, and it can give us a clue that we need to regulate so that we can engage in from a more neutral place. We need to check our over-functioning tendencies. One of my jobs, one of my leadership stints was in the financial services industry, and we used to use StrengthsFinder. If any of you are familiar with that, it's a fun tool. It's a beneficial tool to understand the strengths that you should be leading with, and you have your top 5 strengths. And in this bank, achiever was the most common. It was almost in everybody's top 5. And if they didn't have achiever in their top 5, they were almost a little bit suspect. Like, can you really make it if achiever is not one of your top 5 strengths? So I've worked with a lot of people, a lot of leaders who have this high achiever and can get into some over-functioning tendencies. Sometimes a good enough decision is okay. Sometimes you don't need to solve this. This isn't your decision to make on behalf of other people. Sometimes you can step away and help others make it. So recognizing where we're over functioning can help us regulate our reaction to the decision that needs to be made. We need to develop new ways of interacting with our inner critic. We all have an inner critic, and in fact, we have lots of different voices that go on in our head and sort of get in our way of making a choice or actually acting on the choice that we've made. A lot of people try and push the inner critic in the corner and say, I just need to defeat my inner critic. And I have yet to meet someone for whom that has worked. So I work with people to find a very different way of engaging that inner critic and understanding what is underlying that we need to address. We need to rewrite the stories that we tell ourselves where we're still sitting in the corner and thinking about what we did. We need to shift the way we understand those, or those stories of failure will get in our way. We need to know our values, the things that drive us, what matter to us. They are an anchor, especially when decisions are high stakes, especially now when everything is so unknown. Our values are an incredible anchor, both personal values and organizational values, to know what we believe in, who we want to be, and what we want to stand for when the stakes are high. And finally, being willing to walk away. So with my leaders, this has to do with sometimes you're doing everything right. You're using your process, you're trying to get people on board, you're managing your defensive reactions, you're managing your internal dialogue, and you're in an organization where you can't succeed. And that's real. That is probably, or hopefully, less relevant for you right now, but I include it because it's part of what I teach. And sometimes it's not you, sometimes it's them. And it's okay to acknowledge that and for everybody's sake, move on. Here's some exercises that I want to share with you that I find really beneficial for myself. I use them myself and I give them to my clients. The first piece is meditation. So if the notion of meditation is uncomfortable to you, know that there are lots of ways to enter into this. It's not just sort of the transcendental meditation, sitting in silence, though that is very effective if that's something that works for you. There are lots of ways to still engage that sort of quieting of the mind and changing your energy. There are guided meditations, and there are different activities you can do. I share some in my book. I'm going to share one with you in a minute. There are different activities you can do that still engage that calmer way of being without stillness. There's walking meditation and exercising meditation. Another trick that I use, I do this personally, is facilitating a board meeting with my competing voices. And I teach my clients how to do this, and it's very effective. So we all have all of these different thoughts that conflict going on in our head. If you've ever found yourself saying, well, part of me thinks this and part of me thinks this, you know exactly what I'm talking about. This is very normal. We all have this going on most of the time. We're not always as conscious of it. It can be incredibly helpful when you find yourself stuck, not knowing how to move forward, not sure why you can't pull the trigger, make the decision, even if you're not sure why other people aren't getting on board, to literally write out and sort of name the different opinions coming up and give them names. You know, you may have your inner critic, you may have your inner CFO, you may have a visionary, you'll have your own voices. And these will be common players. The more often you do this, the more you'll recognize their voices coming up. And find a role of facilitator to just air what's there, air what's coming up, be able to engage it, be able to listen. And this is where I say, you know, when people shove the inner critic to the corner, it rarely actually gets quiet. It tends to calm down when it feels heard. So being able to engage in dialogue with these different voices so that you can get them out of your head, get them distinguished from each other, can give you a space of neutrality to understand what all you're wrestling with. And then finally, rewriting your failure stories. I think this is my favorite chapter in the book, is helping people sort of claim, understand what failure stories they hold and shift the meaning that they have. Powerful tools for you. So I said I would share one exercise. It's a pseudo meditation exercise. I put it under that category, though it's not exactly meditation. A lot of my clients are achievers and exercisers. They run, they work out, and they're doing that however they can right now. This is a great way of processing what's getting in our way physically. So before a workout, set a question, set an intention. I find it really helpful to write it down so that it's out of my head. I've physically written it down. I'm not going to forget it. I can come back and see it later, and then leave it there. Go do your workout. You don't need to dwell on that question during your workout. You're working out. Although if you're listening to a podcast, that might get in your way. See if you can leave some space and some silence during at least part of your workout. And when you're done, come back and journal, write, type. It doesn't have to be handwritten, though I think handwritten has more power. Write about that question, and different things will come up for you. Sometimes we find the most clarity when we stop thinking about something. When we do something physically, we're still processing it, but in different ways. So try this if you're an exercising person as a way of accessing the meditation piece, the something that changes what's going on in your mind and gets you out of the sort of emotional hijack that has you stymied. So if you have a strong decision-making process, a couple of things right now, particular to the time we're in that I want you to consider. One is checking out the analytical hierarchy process. AHP for short, you can Google it. You can find free downloadable forms to help you fill this out. This is an excellent tool when things are subjective, when you have different alternatives and you have to weigh them against different criteria. And it's not just, a one to one. It's recognizing that the criteria have weighting themselves. Some criteria matter more to us than others. And so it's a process where you can recognize your criteria, weight them, and then rate each of your alternatives against each criteria. And it helps you get a picture of what matters to you, often from a subjective or a values stance. If you don't have company values and purpose, now is a great time to figure out who you want to be. If you have them, go back to them. Sometimes we put them on a wall and we don't use them for decision making, but that's actually when they're most valuable to us. To really get clear and come back to who are we, what do we believe in, what are we in business for, what do we want to do, who do we want to serve, how do we want to serve them. That will be a critical piece for understanding how to move forward. And if you haven't conducted a stakeholder review refresh, now is the time to do it. So looking at all of your stakeholders, customers, employees, shareholders, community, and thinking about what's the same and what's different. What do they need from us differently now? What will they need from us differently, or can we anticipate in a year's time or even in 6 months' time? So recognizing things are different. We're in an unsteady state right now. We know things are going to change, but we don't know what they're changing to. So again, you can choose to stay put and wait it out, but recognize that that's a choice that you've made and that there is risk associated to it. Weigh your risk, but understand what your stakeholders are needing right now that might be different from what they needed 6 months ago and what they're going to need in the future, and give yourself the time to really dive into this. What do they need from us? What do they expect? What do they want to see from us in 6 months' time? Check for your bias. A few questions. If you are managing that mindset piece, if all of those things that get in your way, if you're managing that, these questions will be so powerful for you. What am I ignoring? How might I be wrong? What other possibilities exist? And what else? These are those decision-making questions that help you think forward and not just stuck in the past. If you're spinning and you need to have a board meeting because too many voices are competing in your head, these questions will just be another voice. So do the mindset work first, calm that inner space down so that you can really tackle these questions and get deeper. You may want to ask other people these questions too. Here's what I'm thinking. What am I ignoring? Here's what I'm thinking. How might I be wrong? What other possibilities am I not exploring yet? So here are the takeaways that I want you to leave this webinar with. I want you to pay attention to your mindset, recognize that it's a critical component of proper decision making. I want you to separate the right now problems you have to solve from the long-term decisions that you want to make. See them as interdependent but distinct, and make sure you're problem solving where you need to problem solve and forward-thinking decision making when you need to be there. Get clear on your vision, values, your stakeholder needs, and ask yourself and others, and ask others to ask you the tough questions to make sure you're thinking as clearly and deeply and fully as you want to be in times like this. So with that, I'll open it up for some Q&A. Thanks for being part of this. And as always, Lessard Consulting here to help. I do executive coaching and one-on-one. I develop leadership at the individual level and at the organizational level. Do strategic planning with stakeholder reviews, values, purpose, and how to activate those, not just have them on the wall. And as I mentioned, I've got a new book out on Amazon, Decision Flow, and I have a 10-week masterclass that I launch every couple of months to help people really dive into the exercises and coach them through the process of getting the mindset that they need to have to really be an excellent decision maker and be able to execute on what they know is right. So with that, Andrea, I think I'll stop sharing and open it up for any questions.
Great, awesome. Just to remind folks who are watching that they can submit their questions in the chat function to the right-hand side of the YouTube screen. So for our first question, it is about how can we experience, how can my experience or the attendees' experience from problem solving influence and improve their decision making?
So how does my expertise in problem solving influence my decision making? So I think one of the best examples I've seen of this has to do with, years ago I went through a training on like incident analysis, understanding like the 5 whys. And taking an incident that happened, like the sinking of the Titanic, and understanding all the different components that went into it. So problem solving is being able to investigate all of the things that we did that we could do differently, all the places where we could do this, or we could do this, or we could do this, that would have changed the outcome. Decision making is choosing which ones we need to pay attention to and have the best forward looking approach for us. So leverage your problem solving to understand the situation, but then be able to shift to, okay, now if I'm not stuck, if I don't just anchor to what I know happened, and I use that problem solving to get a good sense of it, but now I shift to a strategic mindset. So that's the sister skill. How do I look at the future and what's going to be needed in 6 months, in a year? It's going to depend. The time is going to depend on what you're in the middle of, and make sure that I set aside some of that what did happen and look at what will happen or could happen, and then marry them. And it's always good to just check yourself. Am I anchored back there, or am I seeing opportunities and alternatives that might look totally different?
The second question is, how do we find the fine line between getting adequate buy-in and getting mired in the process?
Yeah, that's a great question. So buy-in to me looks like having the conversations with the people who have the most influence. And those aren't the only people you need to have conversations with, but there are hubs of people who have lots of influence over lots of others. Sometimes it's deserved and sometimes it's not. Whether or not we respect that they're a hub, we have to recognize that they're a hub, and make sure that you are having the conversations to understand what's at stake for people. So you might take a sampling of different kinds of people to understand what's at stake for them. You may choose the people who are hubs. You don't necessarily, depending on how large your organization is, have to have one-on-one conversations with everyone, but people want the chance to feel heard. When they have the chance to feel heard, they're more likely to buy in to the future course. So yes, it can be a convenient stalling tactic, right? If the decision's uncomfortable, I can sort of decide we're going to decide by consensus, and I'm going to get everybody's input in, and that will slow your process down, bring it to a halt, probably even. So there is this balance between getting people's input. It's information for you, right? It's a chance to understand and really listen again to what they need, what's at stake for them, what their concerns are, so that when you're presenting out the final decision, they can see themselves reflected in it. So you want as much as you need to have confidence that you've gotten the right information and that you've sort of seeded it with the people who are the biggest influencers in your organization.
And our last question, how do I balance making big decisions with lasting impacts with the recognition that we are currently in, hopefully temporarily, crisis mode?
Yeah. So it's a both and, isn't it? We can't focus only on one without recognizing and responding to the other. So it's a big demand on you as a leader, and you have to do both. You have to stop the bleeding and understand the issue at hand for the future. So how do you do it? Yeah, you're all hands on deck. And so long as you recognize that both of these things are happening, this is in this bucket, this is in this bucket. Often we stall or ignore the important things because of there's so many urgent things going on, and we have to carve out time for the important, or we'll never get there, right? We'll just keep putting out the fires and dealing with the crisis management. So carve out time, whether it's daily or weekly or monthly, whatever that looks like for you and what you're planning. Make sure you're preserving time for that future oriented work, for what is important and what you need to be prepared for down the road. You can't ignore the crisis at hand. You have to address it. And if you're only here, you'll be stuck. You'll be come up short when it's time to implement and know what's coming forward. So you have to manage both. And I know it's a lot.
Well, thank you, Erin. I think that's all the questions we have right now. I want to thank everyone for joining us. But is there any lasting message you want to kind of send our viewers with before we log off?
Sure. So I would say keep up the work. I know everybody's running hard, and there are lots of things to pay attention to, and trust that you have the capability to do it, and that there is some future, and you will find yourself there. You will make it there. So a little bit of self-trust, a lot of work and planning, and supporting the team and the people around you who are trying to make this work with you. Any questions you have, I know some people will be watching this as a live replay later. Feel free to reach out to me, Erin. Let's do info@lessardconsulting.com, and happy to engage a conversation. Please consider buying the book. You can download it in ebook or get the hard copy. And I meant to mention this. I am going to share out the first chapter of the book as a follow-up from this webinar for people, which is all about sort of why decision making is tough, where we get in our own way. So I'll send that out and hope you enjoy that.
Yes. Yeah. So everyone just check in your inbox later. I'll send that out as a follow-up email, and stay tuned for our next webinar. Thank you, Erin.
Thanks, Andrea.